Spectators of the Soviet experiment, who were not fond of Marxism-Leninism, saw it as nothing more than a dystopian society whose regime is informed by instrumental reason, formal logic, and a cold bureaucracy. They thought of the Soviet citizens as empty shells that operated with a machine logic, or as unfeeling drones, best portrayed in the movie The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It probably did not help that communist leaders presented themselves to the public as robots who formulaically repeated their boring statements. In fact, this image might not have been entirely unintended. Many communists deliberately portrayed themselves as mere instruments of the party or higher historical processes. Yet the Bolsheviks did not subscribe to a radicalized formal logic and a rationality that got rid of all ambiguities and paradoxes of human existence. At least not in the way the spectators thought. Rather, they thought in philosophical paradoxes. The Bolsheviks saw themselves as the legitimate leaders of the world revolution because they were able to use the philosophical paradoxes of dialectical materialism to create a totality. A totality that was able to unify all socialist groups, absorb any critique, and serve as a foundation for the one-party state. To understand how this was achieved, we have to take a closer look at some important features of dialectical logic. One of the most important differences between formal logic and dialectical logic concerns the way in which arguments are valued. In formal logic, an argument is invalid if it contains a contradiction. In the total logic of the Communist Party, an argument is invalid if it is one-sided. Opposition to the party and philosophical critiques of Marxism-Leninism were not dismissed as untrue. It is just that these critiques were considered one-sided. What the Bolsheviks called the general line of the party already contained the true parts of the critiques. It would therefore be illogical to insist on them. Dialectical logic is a specific style of governing a field of opposing discourses without falling into a one-sided point of view and deciding for one and against another. Because in this case, one would only serve particular interests and would be unable to achieve totality. Framing the general line of the party as a compromise was no option either. After all, a compromise between the positions would mean that one side would concede part of its position in exchange for a concession. It would mean that all positions have an exchange value on a market of opinions. That is the logic of capitalism. In the Soviet style of governance, on the other hand, it was the party that administered all positions, categorized them, and assigned them their place in the total system. Perhaps it will become clearer if we compare the Communist Party with another institution that shared some similarities in terms of the logic of totality: the Catholic Church. Some of the Church's dogmas contain obvious paradoxes, such as the idea that Jesus is both man and God. Claiming that Jesus was fully man is not heresy, and claiming that Jesus was fully God is also not heresy. But claiming that he was fully man and not fully God at the same time is heresy. So we have the paradoxical situation that one heresy is persecuted because it excludes another heresy. The paradoxical character of the Christian dogmas, particularly the Trinity, was actually one of the inspirations for Friedrich Hegel's dialectics. Yet these paradoxical arguments were not arbitrary, and the Church Fathers did not believe every contradiction is true simply because it is a contradiction. The paradoxes of the Church and the Bolshevik Party were developed in an intensive intellectual work to integrate as many different positions as possible into a stable and total paradox. Here are a few more examples from the Bolshevik Party. After the 1905 revolution in Russia, the Tsar had to tolerate the establishment of the Duma and the election of a parliament. The socialists in Russia now faced the dilemma of whether to join the newly created Duma as elected representatives or boycott the election, remain underground, and fight both the Duma and the Tsar. For Lenin, however, the solution could only be dialectical. The socialist groups should do both. They should participate in the politics of the Duma and, at the same time, fight the Duma, including the elected socialist representatives. A few years after Stalin had defeated the opposition groups around Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, he began to adopt their positions. And the same people who had supported Stalin against the so-called left opposition were now persecuted as right oppositionists. Stalin's position was not directed against these groups, but was the sum of all their positions. In all of Stalin's texts and speeches, just as in the official party documents of the time, there is nothing to be found that cannot already be recognized from the speeches and writings of the various oppositions. The only difference, but one that is all important, consists in the fact that here the conflicting demands of the different oppositions within the party were simultaneously accepted and asserted. Thus, for example, the most rapid possible development of industry would have to be combined with the flourishing of agriculture, and these would reciprocally and dialectically condition each other, and so on. The oppositions were not accused of putting forward their ideas, but of continuing to insist on their point of view, even after the party had already accepted and integrated it. They were accused of insisting on the universality of their one-sided views and not acknowledging the truth of the other oppositions. Whenever a completely new scientific theory emerged, such as Einstein's theory of relativity or cybernetics, Marxists argued about how it should be integrated into the context of dialectical materialism. Initially, both theories were viewed with skepticism in the Soviet Union and classified as idealistic. Marx was opposed to idealist philosophy. He famously turned Hegelian idealism from its head to its feet. But dialectical materialism is also opposed to so-called vulgar materialism. We cannot avoid taking a closer look at dialectics here. As mentioned earlier, dialectical logic recognizes that both A and non-A are true in a certain sense. Nevertheless, they are not equivalent. One can be preferred over the other. According to Hegel's dialectical idealism, both idealism and materialism were true in a limited sense. Yet he clearly favored idealism, hence the name dialectical idealism. Dialectical materialism, on the other hand, prefers materialism to idealism, although it recognizes that idealism contains a truth that so-called vulgar, that is, non-dialectical materialism, refuses to accept. So, if a Western science was to be labeled as idealistic, it would have been doomed as a bourgeois science based on abstract metaphysical principles whose true elements are already superseded by dialectical materialism and whose practical value has already been surpassed by the materialistic Soviet sciences. If it was to be labeled as materialistic, on the other hand, it could be placed alongside the other sciences in the Soviet Union and regarded as a real science whose fundamental principles are only properly explained by dialectical materialism. The theory of relativity and cybernetics would eventually not only be integrated into dialectical materialism, but presented as further proof that dialectical materialism is superior to any other philosophy. All sciences are inevitably heading towards the position where the Soviet philosophers are already waiting for them. What Lenin said about physics applies to all new sciences. Modern physics is in travail. It is giving birth to dialectical materialism. The process of childbirth is painful, and in addition to a living, healthy being, there are bound to be produced certain dead products, refuse fit only for the garbage heap. Sure, cybernetics may come from the West, but once it is cleansed of its idealistic elements, it will reach its true form as a Soviet science, which will only cement the victory of Marxism-Leninism over the reactionary and bourgeois philosophies of the West. Until the 1960s, any critique of Marxism-Leninism was banned, but, strangely enough, it was known to most party members. Critique was simultaneously forbidden and omnipresent. Official announcement of the period targeting anti-Soviet propaganda generally began with the words, "Contrary to the well-known claims by X or Y," although these claims themselves were never officially made public. The communist leadership assumed, that is, either that everyone knew these claims already, or corresponding to the total logic of dialectical materialism, that they could soon work them out for themselves. Whenever a party member came across a criticism of Bolshevism, be it from other Marxists or bourgeois philosophers, they were usually advised to simply compare it with another criticism that contradicted the first. Some opposing Marxists, for example, claimed that Stalin excluded contradictions as the driving force of socialism, while others claimed that the party got too caught up in dialectical arguments. Some claimed that Stalinism was a deformation of Marxism because it returned to Hegel, while others claimed that it lacked Marx's sophisticated philosophical insights, which can only be understood by returning to Hegel. If you read all of these critiques together, you get the party's position. From the outside, it looked as if dialectical materialism was a closed system in which any other position was excluded. But for Soviet philosophers, the opposite was the case. For them, it was an open system that included every position. The Bolsheviks were convinced Marxists until the very end of the Soviet Union, and there is no indication that they ever questioned it. Once you're inside this system of thought, it is quite difficult to get out. From the inside, it looks as if every possible position is already known and part of the thought system. Do you think that history is driven by humans, or rather by anonymous social forces? Do you think that idealism is an abstract and unworldly philosophy, or that materialism is a crude and simplistic worldview? Whichever position you take, it is already integrated into the total philosophy, which is always one step ahead of you. And if you take one of these positions radically against the total system, you become one-sided, which feels like a demotion. We have to come down from the heavens of totality to the earthly market of one-sided ideas and compromises. Once, every Soviet schoolchild had to learn what dialectical materialism is. Today, there is not much left of it in the post-Soviet sphere. Unlike in Western academia, dialectical logic in the Soviet Union had only one purpose, namely to provide the party with a tool for creating a totality. And when the Soviet project was dissolved, dialectical thinking vanished overnight.